everyone, welcome to HR Show and Tell. I'm your host, Michelle Berg, Chief Visionary Officer of Elevated HR. In this episode, we talk with Organizational Psychologist Justin Deonarine. We get vulnerable when it comes to talking about our own burnout. We dig into psychological safety and the need for transparency in the workplace. And finally, we give tips and tricks to build boundaries to keep yourself, well, safe. It all begins right now.
So let's just dive right in, shall we? In terms of in terms of the pandemic and things that you were talking about, conflict and leadership challenges and change. One of the things that I know that I get asked significantly all the time is that, do you just notice that people have a lower tolerance these days, and whether that means they're either more passive aggressive than they were, or they're just heading straight into conflict more than they ever did before. Are you noticing that in your practice right now too? And is it a symptom of the pandemic, or do you think it's just something else?
So it's kind of twofold. There is the challenge that everybody is very much under a lot more stress right now, whether or not you realize that you're under that stress. Some people don't realize that it is affecting them, but there are small changes in their behavior that indicates it. One thing that I've been noticing, though, not only from speaking with people, but also through some data, is that people are more hesitant to actually engage um, in conflict where they are seeking what they need for themselves. So they're less willing to push right now. There is an element of fear and uncertainty where, hey, I don't really want to rock the boat right now, so whatever the plan is, let's just go with it.
Mm.
There's also a sense of, I don't know that what I want is actually important anymore, because that could change. In
Hmm.
3 months from now, what I need now, and I could push for it right now, but in 3 months that might change. So maybe I need to wait and push for that in 3 months.
Hmm.
So what we're seeing is that collaboration and um, assertiveness to some degree is actually lower than it was prior to the pandemic, because people are just more hesitant to actually push for what they need.
Huh. And that's what the data is showing you.
The data plus some interaction on top of that,
Okay.
plus some of the challenges that I've been speaking to business owners and to business leaders about.
Okay. Because in my experience right now, what we've been noticing, and maybe it's just the type of clients that we work with as well, but what happened when people were at home or have been at home, and we've shared this in a previous webinar that we've done as well, is that when people are at home, they are feeling safer, and
Mm,
so we're getting far more instances of at least people are making the complaints around bullying and workplace respect violations, et cetera. And that has, I mean, our practice has
yeah.
by far quadrupled, because it almost feels like people are feeling safe and actually now asking for what they need because they don't have to face that person every day.
Yeah.
So that's, but maybe we're talking about two different things here too, as it relates to that. I almost hear you saying too, like the motivation is so low that the give a shit factor, as I like to refer to it, is just not, it's just not there anymore.
To some degree, yeah. What we're the level of stress, yes, working from home provides a little bit of that anonymity to some degree, that safe environment.
Yeah.
um but what we're ending up seeing is that perhaps there are communication challenges that are also driving those increased complaints of bullying, for example, because that's where where I've seen sometimes conflict happen, where the virtual environment's really hard to navigate. Emails lose nuance, lose tone.
Mhm.
So lag and interactions via Zoom, we're still tripping over each other trying to figure out when one person's ended their sentence and or ended their thought, and when the next person kicks in. So there is a sometimes a tendency to interpret these things as perhaps negative, or they were um, as offensive, basically, not seeing that there's a positive intent behind it, or a positive, or a positive. The tone of the email is taken differently from the person reading it than the person who is writing it intended, and that may come off as more negative. So I'm also seeing some of those communication challenges of the virtual environment coming in and playing a factor.
Yeah, no, totally. And someone here has just made a comment too that it could totally be dependent on the side of the coin they are on. They are on either they don't want to lose their job, or I'm in control and they don't have a choice right now. Like there's, yeah, I
Yeah.
see it both ways. So it's a fair, definitely a fair point. Okay, so as it comes to you and making the move into being an organizational psychologist, it is the way, you know, when we look at trends in human resources and things like that, it is where we've read now for years that this is the way that human resources is going to be going, that most organizations are either going to provide access to a psychologist, or they're going to work directly with a psychologist, specifically at that executive level team, or they'll even go so bold, and we've seen it in Silicon Valley big time. They've hired permanent, and we've seen it on Wall Street for quite some time too. And like the hit show, you know, Billions, where they have one on side, you know, how I see it moving in that direction. I saw it moving in that direction. You have clearly also known this, but you've decided to really focus on those small and medium-sized businesses. What led you down this path? Like, what is it about small and medium-sized businesses do you see needs your support? Take us through your journey there.
Sure. So a lot of my work, full time, I work for Psychometrics Canada. So I end up uh, working with a lot of larger organizations, and helping those organizations. So through culture shift in my own business, I've been focusing on small to medium sized businesses, because where I have seen the opportunity is just more so to get ahead of the problems rather than wait for them to occur. So if we think about medium-sized businesses, once they get to a certain point, they call it the growing pains. When they need to expand beyond a certain point, it starts to become challenging. They start to have to say that entrepreneur needs to start to delegate more work out, or needs to start focusing on one area rather than another, and this becomes a bit of a challenge. And it's a matter of, so the especially the medium-sized businesses I'm able to work with, it's getting ahead of the challenges that larger organizations face, because they haven't been proactive about tackling these challenges. And that's why with Culture Shift, I've been focusing more on the small to medium sized businesses to try to help them start on the right path, rather than experiencing the growing pains first, then realizing after sleepless nights and possibly loss of productivity, um, that, oh wait, I should really be searching for this help. Because unfortunately what happens is most of the clients that I work with, um and historically speaking, most of the clients that I've worked with are at the point where they're feeling the pain, and now they've brought somebody in to help them.
Right.
It's not as common to see a client really be proactive and try to prevent the challenges. It's, oh well, this last person, when we take a look at our ROI, we lost about $80,000 on this person because they just weren't they weren't capable of doing what they promised in the interview. So now we've lost quite a bit of money. We should probably look for ways to try to make sure that people are a good fit for the role, for the culture, before we bring somebody on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you are then used primarily, specifically on the psychometric assessment side. Is that primarily recruitment then that you're that you're
I,
doing that with,
I
or
use assessments for everything that I do, pretty much.
everything that you do?
Whether it's selection, engagement, or coaching, I use them for everything as
Okay.
as a basis. It gives you the insights that you need. So let's talk, for example, the coaching side of things. It's about providing that self-awareness. It's about providing that base and seeing where that person's starting, and then allowing them to, and then guiding that conversation.
Okay. So the one thing that I'm always curious about when it comes to a psychologist on site is, at what point do you have a duty to uphold confidentiality for the employee versus the employer who is, I think, would be paying you? How do you navigate that?
That's tricky. Typically speaking, the confidentiality is upheld. There are very few circumstances where we're dealing with a one-on-one individual, or some sort of circumstance, and I have come across them. I have helped organizations or teams work through, say, a conflict issue. In that case, everybody is going in with awareness that we're going to be having a group discussion about this. So everything stays within that group, but every party comes willing, as a willing participant to that conversation. So the HR individual, the manager, and the employee, the four of us will sit down. The But otherwise to that, so let's take employee engagement, for example. I'm never saying Phil did this, Bob did that,
Right.
um Michelle did this, right? It's all, or said this. It's always that aggregate. So here's the things that I've been hearing. Here's the aggregated results of this, say, investigation. So um, these are the themes, the patterns that I'm seeing, that I'm hearing, and here's how we can address them.
Okay. So it's pretty similar to how we operate then typically in HR as well. I mean,
Yes.
I do, confidentiality to me has always been super important. And especially if there's, and where I always tell the person, I am going to have to break confidentiality if the organization is at risk. So if you're coming forward and you have been assaulted, or you have, something has happened in that realm, I can't sit aside and just allow. It sounds like you would do the same if someone disclosed that to you as well.
Thankfully, I don't cross into that area often, or ever.
Okay.
So I haven't had to cross that bridge. But yes, if there's a legal, say, a legal or a larger ramification concern, there are certain ethical, moral guidelines that as an organizational psychologist I have to follow.
Okay.
So
But in the meantime, can you also rely on, I don't know, again, I'm thinking of the words that I learned off of TV, but like, what is that, patient psychologist, like confidentiality, like the agreement that you're bound to that in the same way, privileged from that perspective. Is that accurate?
yes, whether or not it's a requirement as an organizational psychologist, it's something that I uphold.
Okay.
I'm sure it is something that I am being held to, but I take that more from a personal moral standpoint, more so than anything else.
Because that is the expectation, right? Like i
Yes.
think i think when they hear psychologist and someone who can practice, the expectation, if I'm coming to see you, is that what I say to you stays here.
Yeah.
And I'm looking to you to help support me through this, often. So actually, this is a really good segue. Erica has just asked a question, and here it says, many companies, including mine, are increasing or implementing mental health strategies and programs. We are noticing more employees coming forward to discuss their mental health, which is something we have stressed is important to communicate and normalize. In the HR function, we are taught that we are to show empathy, but not to be a psychologist and just to refer the employee to an EFAP or provide them resources. I find that this is starting to prevent employees from coming forward for fear of HR not giving a shit or not able to actually help them, and instead turns them away to get help somewhere else. what is the best way to respond to an employee so they feel supported, but without HR moving into a role that they are not designed for? Example, organizational psych.
Yeah.
Is there a good one or two liner that shows we care, we understand, we want to know, without giving advice that is out of our scope?
I think that question is my answer. Is just showing that support, showing and letting them know. I always say honesty is the best policy. So this is out of my scope, but here are the resources that we can provide, and take that time to walk them through it, take that time to help them with it, to show that you're going to be with them throughout that time. So if they're coming for help, to show them, yes, I'm here to walk alongside you through this journey, you're not alone. And I think that's what I've heard employees looking for, just to know that they're not alone in this, that it's not a matter of, here's some stuff to navigate. Oh, now there's more that I have to try to figure out on my own when I'm already facing whatever challenges that I am. They're looking just for that support. Now, of course, they may start to try to dive into things, and that's where honesty is the best policy.
Mhm.
Generally speaking, people are you know eh, they they understand. So if there's something that there are lines that you can't cross, if you're upfront and honest about them, in my experience, i I can't say I've ever had somebody react really poorly to it, where it's like, okay, this unfortunately I can't. This is outside of my scope.
Right.
So let's pursue this together.
And so to that end, I'll just say I have had,
Okay.
like where people do say, well, what are you, you're useless, like what are you here for? And
Yeah.
that's cut me to the core at times, because I think, while most of us don't, grow up wanting to be in human resources, that's not nobody puts their hand up in grade one and says, I'm going to be HR. What we do find ourselves in these roles for is because we do have a sense of duty and want to support. And in my world, I created Elevated because I didn't think work should suck.
Yep.
So I have seen that, I have heard that. And then I've also had CEOs and leaders to say, you're not supposed to be the psychologist of the department, because HR turns into the department of the complaints.
Yep.
And so, but to your point, we aren't going to be able to serve everyone. And I agree with you. The transparency is where I've won. Typically, when someone comes to me as well, that's the same thing. Like, look, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm very transparent and almost vulnerable with my own path into specifically around mental health. Let's take that. We'll use that as an example. And here are the resources I've used. And I'll even say, like, if EFAP hasn't always been great, I'll say that, but you know what? I've started using X, Y, or Z. And I think when you can really use your own experience to help another, that's when they look at you and they say, oh yeah, okay, I can do this. But we've had some wild ones, and I've called the police for them, or I'll help them find a lawyer, or I'll, even if they're doing, but I don't do that because it's part of the job. I do that because I'm a human and want to help, and that it's a hard road. And I would say then, as an HR practitioner, what becomes even more difficult sometimes is, and this, I'm actually totally curious on how you do this, but is separate yourself, like compartmentalize from the things that you're hearing. Cause that's where I start. I was saying earlier this year, I feel like I've even had PTSD from this year, when we'll phone various employees at organizations that we've been part of letting go just to do wellness checks. And that, like, I have a hard time doing it now, even though that's like part of my DNA. So how as an organizational psychologist do you compartmentalize? Or does it just not go into that deep? And maybe that's what it's easier being an organizational psychologist than, a counselor in trauma.
Yeah, I mean, historically speaking, I've had to deal with some tougher things that I've seen, that I've heard. Some of the stories that I've heard are tragic, are challenging. Some of the things that employees are going through in their personal lives and why it's impacting their performance at work. I mean, and that's and exactly what you said is the trick, compartmentalizing it. I know it's tough to do that, and there are even days where it's just kind of like, oh, okay. Like getting through it is just it is a challenge, and when I come home, it is still sometimes a challenge. But um the way I approach it is I always leave that situation knowing that I did everything that I could for that person, or I did what I could within reason. That was basically, if I can look myself in the mirror and say I did what I felt I had to or I could to help them, that's really what gets me through those.
Hmm.
That's it. Compartmentalizing is hard. I don't really know if I have advice on how to compartmentalize. I know I am better at it than say other people are, but that's just something that I've naturally been able to do to some degree. I've been able to do it from when I was young. Um, but I'm not sure if there's steps that I really have in my head that I can do that. For me, it's if I'm looking at myself in the mirror at the end of the night and I can say I tried my best
Hmm.
and I did what I could to help this person, that's really what helps me.
Okay, that's fair. Some days I think I'm the queen of compartmentalization, and then it just like is all on my chest, and
Yeah.
I don't know what to do after that. We have an anonymous question here around. I think this is in reference to when I said I do have to breach confidentiality at sometimes. The question is, when you breach the confidentiality, do you inform that employee before you tell other people? In my experience, I always have. I feel like that's only fair. The same thing I set up as an HR practitioner as well. I set it up. If you're coming to see me, I will tell you upfront, we'll have an upfront verbal contract about what's confidential versus what's not. And I even let them know that before they disclose anything, and so that they know what the consequences of disclosure. And that sounds terrible, but I have a duty to, again, to protect these team members. And
Exactly.
yeah, so from that perspective, I don't know if you do anything different, Justin.
No, for me, it's always been upfront, and it's always been in the situations where confidentiality from that say manager employee level isn't there anymore. It's always those group conversations with somebody from HR around also, so that it's more of a group discussion and everybody is aware that they're going into that.
Okay. We got another tough question here. I don't know if you're reading it, but I'll read it out loud here. Our
Okay.
leadership team have great relationships with their direct reports and often end up having conversations where they're offering advice or support to personal challenges or obstacles. Do you have any advice on how to coach, support team leads who may experience that blur between personal and professional performance support, especially advising them on where that line is, where they should be referring out, or where they're able to have a conversation themselves? Is there a line where it almost becomes unethical for a lead to support or advise if they're not the expert or a health professional?
Yeah. Couple thoughts on this. The first one is the line between personal and professional sometimes can be blurred to a small degree, which I think this person is referring to, because that's what helps build that trust. Um, the fact that they see each other as people, as human. Now, when it means going too far, that's where, okay, if they're not a if they're so if they're speaking to somebody about a personal issue from their experience, or listening to them, or providing them with just that human support, that's where I don't find that they're crossing that line. It's when they start crossing the line and trying to become a counselor, trying to go outside of their expertise, and that's where I think that would be that would be the point that they should be advising the individual to speak with somebody that is more specialized in that, but providing a human level of support and providing that personal support, I don't really see that as a challenge so long as it's staying within, say, ethical guidelines. It's not turning into something more than it should be, or something where the two parties are becoming uncomfortable with it.
I was driving from Golden this morning and I was listening to Adam Grant and Brene Brown speaking this morning. And Adam Grant is on the Work Life podcast. And one of the things that they said as well is, you've got to have vulnerability, but with boundaries. And so what it sounds like is like if they're talking about their own, to your point, where they're talking about their own lived experience, that's their lived experience and they can share. But then they also have to be vulnerable enough to say, this is where my line goes. I want to help and I want to support, but being upfront, again, it's that idea of radical candor, being clear is being nice, and really identifying what that is for them as leaders. I think giving them that context, and but it does, because I think too in this question where it goes off the rails sometimes is, okay, well, we were just talking about my mental health and my challenges at home, and now you're putting me on a performance improvement plan.
Yeah.
Right. But that's just it. Like that is the hard, I think, line of leadership in general. It doesn't matter if it's mental health or otherwise. If you're going to create a relationship with someone, there are going to be times where you're going to have to put the stake in the sand, similar to a parent. Right. At times when you're a parent, you can be a friend, but sometimes you also have to be that person who draws the line and says enough's enough. And that's where this is giving them. This comes down to probably communication styles, understanding communication styles, and things like that. But I don't think I would. Yeah. So I think that's as far as we'll go there.
I think there's just the important point is it's the element of psychological safety. So showing that human side, showing that vulnerability, being willing to listen and to provide that support is where the leader's role extends to. It's when it comes into that level of, okay, this is now something that I think I don't think I can really help you with. It's understanding those lines and addressing them. Within the lines, it creates psychological safety. Beyond the lines, it doesn't.
Right. And even just saying this goes beyond my scope, but I'm still here for you to help you to find someone who can support you. I think giving that language to leaders and managers is often important too. And those lines are different for everyone as well. Again, that's where boundaries come into play.
Yes.
And knowing what your boundaries are, and even having conversations with leaders and managers about boundaries and how do I set boundaries, giving them that language in a lot of ways is also really helpful in this context. So this question here, I'm not quite sure how I would answer this one at all, but how do you manage employees who identify as QAnon supporters?
I have, to be honest, I think this is, I haven't come across this. This one's hard to answer. Reach out to me. Let me think about this one a little bit more, and let me mull over this one. More than happy to have that conversation. More than happy to chat. But this is not something that I have the experience in up front, so I can't speak from experience on this. But if I can provide some guidelines, some guidance in any way, I just need some time to think about this one, because it's not a
Yeah, and we'll give out your contact info at the end of this as well. I know for me too, like just in general, whether or not this isn't, definitely necessarily identifying as QAnon, but really being it's that idea of being understanding of all people and all things and that are different than what I am. That's a challenge in today's world all over the place. And so
Exactly.
I'd like, yeah, if you can find anything, because I'm sure this isn't going to be the first time we're going to be asked a question like this.
Yeah.
How do you support this? And can you? That's
Yeah.
the other side of this too.
Yeah.
Can you really tie support to that? There's a whole lot there.
Yeah. And to the point that was brought up in chat, it is a sensitive issue. And navigating it, that's where I haven't had to navigate this before. So it is a bit of a sensitive issue, and that's why I don't want to give an answer and then without thinking it through. So
I like how you drew that boundary, Justin.
yes. And thank you for understanding on that.
Yeah. Michelle, we've got another question here, so I am just going to add, we'll just jump right into this one too. We can come back to my questions. I love this. This is great.
I like this. Yeah.
This isn't directly related to what we've been speaking about, so it can be answered anytime, but I'm wondering how, as a leader or employee, you can set a boundary when you feel that you can't listen to other people's personal challenges due to your own emotions, mental health, current situation, and the threat of vicarious trauma, or just pushing yourself too far emotionally. Yes, Justin, I would like to know this too.
I think part of it is self-awareness, being aware of where those boundaries are for you personally. How far can you go? What can you handle? What can't you handle? How far can you go in that? And I think that's to determine those boundaries. Is awareness of self. That's part of it. The other one is being aware of your comfort and being aware of what needs to be an elevated conversation rather than this is okay, this is something that we can chat about individually. Oh, this now becomes something that we need to bring in HR, or we need to bring in somebody, we need to bring in support on this to have this conversation. So it's awareness of self as well as awareness of situation, or environmental or guidelines. I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah. And again, it comes down to recognizing that being vulnerable is around those boundaries, setting those boundaries for yourself, and being okay. I think those who struggle with this most tend to also be those who are people pleasers. That's where they sit in their seat, and that's part of their identity and who they are. And then there gets to that point where we were going to jump into next anyways, was burnout.
Yep.
And this year I have probably never experienced as much burnout as I did this year. I'm so thankful for the options, that I could still go see a psychologist, even this way versus having to go in person.
Yep.
Because I had to work through a lot of stuff this year. Mm-hmm. And especially that I didn't know that I was having, struggling with vicarious trauma until after it had already happened. So that's I think that's the tough part, is you can have self-awareness, but until you're put in a situation where you're hearing something and go, oh, I'm now not equipped at all. You can't unhear it.
Yes.
That's what I'm struggling with most is I can't unhear these things, but how, when I'm working with my own therapist, how I'm attaching, certain things to that, and learning to let go. And again, working through some of that stuff. That for me has been the only way I could have gotten through this, because I used to be that person who's like, nope, keep on trugging, keep on going, I'm going to handle this by myself. And the truth is, you just can't. I couldn't. But it's different for each person.
Exactly.
In terms of their journey as well.
And for me, in those situations, when I gave that example of looking at myself in the mirror at the end of the day and saying, did I do what I could for this person? So long as you have taken the steps that provides that person with that support, with that help, even if you're not the one doing it personally. So you've heard something, but you take those steps to take care of yourself also. And you brought up a great point, Michelle, that taking care of yourself also, because that's part of it. That yes, you can hear things that are challenging, that are difficult to you can't unhear it, and finding a way to help yourself through that, and whether it's speaking to somebody, whether it's whatever your approach is that helps you, that's part of the key. And to your point with burnout, seeing burnout, yes, burnout has been increasing. I have been seeing more cases of burnout throughout the pandemic also, because of that added layer of stress. But I've been seeing cases of burnout for the past 10 years, where you just see those individuals emotionally, mentally, physically exhausted. And y- that point of you don't know what it is until you experience it is to some degree true. I've been able to help other people identify that because of my own experiences with burnout. So because I know what that looks like now, because now in retrospect, reflecting on it, I can see where it was that I hit burnout. Of course, in my case, I don't want to call it an advantage, but I had the clear signal that when I end up in the hospital for burnout, that's probably a sign that I'm burned out. So um, I've been able to identify the steps that led me there, to be able to be able to see them. And when I see other people just with that emotional, that physical, that mental drain, and they're not quite themselves anymore, that's where I know, okay, is this person on track towards burnout, and that conversation can happen.
So for me, when I was on the track to burnout, I didn't end up in the hospital, but I certainly melt down. There's no question about that. Um, when you were on your way and you were heading into the hospital, that was your clear sign you were that. But did anyone say anything to you beforehand? Did you have like these things that people, like when you look back at that now, and do you help others to identify those things too? Because I'll be honest, my team knew it about me. In fact, I even had one or two team members probably even say something, and I got mad at them. Like that was my own trigger. Like I was triggered, and it's like, I'm fine. I'm fine. I've got this.
Yeah.
How do we, so if we're seeing this in others, is there a way, is there a strategy that you can help to prevent that essentially?
The way I've approached it in the past is I've sat down with the person and said, "Hey, what's going on? What like what's I see that you're visibly stressed. Talk to me about it.
Mm,
Let's talk through it a little bit. Tell me what's going on." Just being there for that person, providing that support, has really helped them really understand it. And by the end of that conversation, that's where I've opened up with that. Okay, look, I'm concerned about you,
mhm,
because I've been down that path myself.
right.
I know the detriments. I know the effects of burnout, and I don't want you to get there. So let's have that conversation. Let's how can I help? How
Mhm,
can I help you prevent this, basically?
right.
So
Okay, so we've got an interesting juxtaposition and follow-up question to the previous one, where, okay, that's great if you are wanting to help and you're wanting to have that conversation,
yep,
but what if you just can't? And
yeah,
you want to be able to say, I'm so sorry, I cannot talk about this. And it's not can't, in a way it's I'm setting that boundary that I need to separate myself from this. Do you have language, or do you have I think she's looking for a bit of coaching, Justin, on how she can still be respectful and seem
yeah,
supportive, but also also again honor herself at that
yes,
point.
yep. And this is where I always go with honesty and transparency is the best policy. Um, Again, I've never I've never had it backfire on me. So that could be why I've been encouraged to just go with that approach. To me, it's a matter of just actually saying that I'm really sorry, but at this point, I'm not sure that beyond this point, I don't know if I can really help you with this. However, I'm here to support you. So let me find some resources. Let me help you help yourself, basically. Let's get you on the right path. So if I can't help you personally, if like, I'm more than happy to have these conversations, but I know that I'm not the one. So for example, with burnout, I'm not the one that can help them with that. I can start that conversation, I can get them pointed in the right direction, but I'm not a registered therapist. So I'm not a clinical psychologist. So I can listen as a friend, as somebody who supports them, but there is a point where, okay, let's also take these steps to move you in the right direction. And I think that for me, that's part of um what helps me say I did what I can for them, because I got them, I have helped them get on the right path. I can't help them personally, but I have helped get them into that path. And that's where I'm just very open with it. I'm very transparent about it. I just tell them, I want to see you, I want to help you, I want to see you um, do well. I want to see you get through this, but I'm not the person for that. So
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Um, okay. I think here. Um, Now, regarding change management, because you do work in change management, you were talking about that, and Eric has asked this question: is there anything new in your research to help early adopters adopt that in the change, especially after going through a pandemic and increased stress in the workplace for employees this past year? Is there better or new techniques that you're finding working already? What's, essentially, I'm thinking, what's the trends these days in helping change? Is there anything new? What have we learned from the pandemic?
yeah, I think so. How I have been encouraging people to approach change pre-pandemic and during the pandemic has been pretty much the same. There is a huge emphasis on communication and psychological safety. So really, that's what we need, both pre and during pandemic, is just that communication. So part of it is making sure that everybody is clear about what's going on, with that transparency, what's going on, how you're looking to handle this, um, what are the pros and the cons, how will this impact them. It's just being open and honest and having that conversation. Yes, there's going to be grumbling. People don't like having changed forced on them. That's human nature. People
That's
love.
not new.
Sorry.
That's not new either,
That's
right?
not new. Oh, that is certainly not new. And this is, I've heard this said before, so this is somebody else's words. Um, People love change when they have control over it. So we change all the time. We take vacations, which is a change of scenery. We change what we wear. That's called fashion. Um, but we have control over those changes. So we're more accepting of them because we have that control. We're the one really moving that forward. Um, People have a harder time accepting change that's forced on them. So that's where it's that trust, that transparency, allowing people to ask those questions. It's one, change becomes very difficult to process through when you keep people in the dark. That's when it becomes a big challenge. Now, yes, transparency comes with its own challenges. People are going to ask questions. You are going to have to think about things more, but I also like to look at it as diversity of perspectives. Maybe you overlooked something that somebody else has noticed, or has thought about, and you can account for these things and say, make the plan a little bit better. Or at least figure out how you're going to address this challenge that could come up as a result of it. Um, and really it comes down to that setting a consistent vision, um, building that communication, that trust, and providing that psychologically safe environment for people to ask their questions. So if they have concerns, that they feel safe enough to have those conversations.
But that's the change that needs to occur, right? Is
Yes.
that's actually where it starts. It's building a culture of that. And that is, even 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I was certainly having conversations around psychological safety. And I'll admit, I was rolling my eyes. I was like, oh my gosh, here we go again. And 2.5 years later, recognizing how important psychological safety is, and yet there maybe you can provide some of this too, Justin, for us, but it would be great to read some sort of body of research of organizations who shifted a culture to psychological safe culture. For us, I think we've done it organically. I probably didn't. I know I didn't always provide a psychologically safe organization to challenge me, to give me feedback, those kinds of things. So it really does start at the top. I mean,
Yep.
ultimately.
Yep.
And first and foremost, you got to have buy-in then, that we want
Yep.
people to be able to bring themselves there. The tough part I'm finding right now in supporting organizations who are going through a psychological safe mindset change, or a shift, I guess, around it, is that adage of don't ask questions you don't want the answers to. And so on the flip side, now we get all these questions and all this feedback, and because they're psychologically safe to do so. And I'm finding executive leaders burning out even more now too, just being exhausted because they're trying to do all things for all people, and they're still supposed to be so strong for everybody else. And now you're challenging me on a word choice,
Yes. Yep.
or and then I just find that then the opposite starts to happen, and these executives start to close up and stop being transparent, because that doesn't feel good. I
Yep.
can't worry about all those little things. So I don't know if you've got any bodies of research on that new, specifically around psychological safety and what it means, but I'd love to see anything around that too, because I'm still having a hard time convincing the CEOs I work with. They know it's important for people to feel safe. No one's going to take that away. Like, no one's going to challenge that.
Yep.
But is there lines? Is there levels? Is there, or and because you can't just wake up one day too and say, look, everyone better be psychologically safe here now. Like, it doesn't work like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And it's so easy for us to throw out the terms, but really hard to put into practice.
I have two articles that come to mind. One that I wrote, one that another psychologist wrote. That come to mind immediately whenever anyone asks for how do I build that psychologically safe environment. I will send both links to you, Michelle, and when everything is being sent out to the attendees, the recording, etc. I think that would be the quickest way to get those links into everyone's hands.
Thank
I
you.
will just write myself a note for that.
You got it. You got it. Okay, so we were really going to talk about, you know, and we're coming up to the end too. So I'm going to skip a couple of the questions that we've had. But
Sure.
one is, how do you determine ROI in your work? Like, so often we are asked, and challenged in HR to come up with a number to justify what and why we're doing the work that we're doing. As it relates to the work that you can do in organizations, what is that number? How do you know you're getting that return on the investment?
So in my circumstance, it's pretty unique for ROI, because ROI for me is a conversation. The my clients can calculate ROI on their own. So let's take the most simple example of having to let somebody go or somebody leaving. So turnover, easiest situation to calculate ROI. Pretty much whether the organization realizes or not, they have the data, or they can at least provide an estimate to themselves of what of the ROI on preventing turnover. So I ask very simple questions such as, what did it cost when they left? So if somebody was in the role for a long time, when they left, what were the costs of that turnover? And let's assume that the person wasn't happy when they left.
Mhm.
So not only have you lost productivity, you've lost expertise, but you can measure these things financially. You can see the loss in productivity. Even small and mid-sized organizations, I'm able to walk them through. Okay, here's some things to look at. Then let's take a look at the easy to observe costs. What's the cost of having to rehire?
Mhm.
So now you have to go through time and efforts for the job posting. You have to go through interviews again. You have to uh, there's the whole process involved in onboarding them. Then you've got that 50-50 chance that they've worked out. So now what happens if you have to turn that person over again? Because within 3 months, it turns out that person wasn't a good fit. So for me, ROI comes in two forms: the actual dollar figure, the actual justification, but then also that pain experience. And I mean, every organization has experienced some sort of human capital challenge, human capital pain.
Mhm.
And that sticks. It's I call it the negativity bias, or the negative bias. People remember pain more than they remember, say, joy or pleasure, because um, that's how we're wired. We're wired to understand that if we stick our hand in the fire, it's hot and we shouldn't do that again. So that ends up overriding a lot of things. So it's really easy to find that pain point for somebody, but then for that ROI in those numbers, it's as simple as, what's the cost of having to rehire somebody?
Mhm.
If you have unhappy employees, and they're leaving, and you're having to rehire, there's very visible costs that are easily measurable attached with that.
There's also a cost, though, to keeping someone who is toxic within the organization as well. Do you evaluate both approaches when they say, like, we think it might be this person? Is it, but we don't know if it's worth keeping or worth going? I mean,
Yep.
we deal with high performers all the time. For example, sales is
Yes.
probably a good, where they're the highest revenue generators, but they also can come with an a-hole complex, right? And
Yeah.
so, and sometimes, yes, it's going to hurt the organization from a revenue perspective, but when they're gone, it's amazing to see how the organization rallies together. Do you come in and do those kinds of assessments too?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
So there have been situations. The more common is the reverse, where
Okay.
people are leaving, they're not entirely sure why.
Mm.
And then from that, when they're not entirely sure why, that's where if I dig a little bit further, I find, oh, okay, there might be a common challenge. It comes back to those, what are those patterns? What are those common challenges? And if there is a toxic element, as much as I don't like to call them that, but let's call a spade a spade. If there is a toxic element, it comes out pretty quickly.
Okay.
So I've seen entire teams break down because there's one person, and as soon as that person was removed, and they kept the person for too long, as soon as the person was removed, the entire team recovered, basically. Productivity, morale, everything right back up through the roof. Communication became they went from no communication to communicating on a regular basis. So that's where there's some, and I've seen that in multiple circumstances.
Mm.
So it's when digging deeper, why are people leaving? That's when I tend to find those situations, and and then we can talk about what to do at that point.
Okay. Okay, my last question for you. Oh, although we did just get another question too, but my last question, then we'll go into this one. Actually, you know what? How do you convince your superiors that someone needs to be removed? Is the question.
That's that's it's a tough one. Um, it, I, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it comes down to that transparency. Um, uh, One of the things in my work history that has been an advantage is that I'm kind of where conversations that other people would hesitate to have, I don't. This has been a double-edged sword sometimes. Sometimes people don't like it, sometimes people do. I think where it is looking at those patterns to some degree and seeing, working with those patterns. So if there is somebody that is a challenge on the team, um or within the organization that you're dealing with, it's having those transparent, open conversations. And believe me, I understand it might be easier for me, and especially within my role coming in as an outsider looking in, it's really easy for me. But internally, I've had those conversations in the past, and it's a little scary. Yeah, I will fully admit that. But I also knew I was coming in, and one of the things I prefaced it with is I'm coming in with best intentions. I'm not, I don't want to complain about this person. I don't want to harp on this person. But here's what I'm seeing from an objective outsider looking in perspective. Um, but I also, in some of those cases, had other people observing the same thing. I had that support. You're gonna know through the office grapevine if a person that you're finding to be a challenge for the organization is a challenge for other people. You're gonna see it. You're gonna observe it. You're gonna see it in team interactions, and it's a matter of having that conversation. Now, of course, if there's I have been fortunate that in those situations there has been psychological safety, that I have been able to go forward and have those conversations. And I've had, in the past 10 years, I've only had to have two of them. Um, but with my boss, I had that feeling of safety that I could go have this conversation and say, I'm not doing this because I have a problem with them on a personal level. I'm looking at from the impacts that they're having on other people, not just myself. And this is a concern that I see,
Yeah.
and it's tough. I get it. Um,
Well,
I'm
and I'll be honest too. I'm a little nervous right now because we've certainly had this in our program. We've been coaching. We coach both sides. We'll coach an individual who it seems like nobody likes, nobody respects. So right away you hear all those things and all those stories, but no one's saying anything to the person, no one's setting expectations, no one's owning their stuff or communicating in a way that that person is hearing. And so then I get real worried about cancel culture too, just because
yes,
there's a group of people now canceling out a person, but because I'm too scared to have a conversation that they hear me in a language
yes,
that they hear me in. It's much easier to go complain or
yep,
and not do anything. So again, I think when it comes to supervisors, it's right, it's vulnerable to transparency. And then what's your data?
yeah,
Demonstrate what is it that you have done. If you're trying to convince your superiors that this person is no longer a culture fit, what's your data? Demonstrate all that, use all that. But to go and to vent to your supervisor, no, like especially when they're performing, at an okay level, you got to have some data there that's more than just a gut feel. And
yes,
especially in an environment where people, we hire people all the time to come in and change and to help change. A lot of people don't like that. And so
yes,
then they band together as well, and they create a new narrative around a person, and then that person can never succeed. And that to me is more toxic
yeah,
than anything. So it's coming back to your behaviors, your actions,
yeah,
and the results that you're trying, again, the conversations you're trying to have. And
yeah,
I would agree with you, transparency is everything, but again, it's data too. It's got to be data driven.
yes. And I think that's the important. You brought up a really important point that I didn't mention or I glossed over. In that conversation that I have with the supervisor, it's a matter of, I'm not saying fire them. I'm saying let's have a conversation with them. Let's get some coaching for them. In both the conversations that I've gone through personally, I have tried to sit down with the individual and have that conversation. Um, and I saw change, but short term change. So they reverted back to their old behaviors after a little bit. So it's a matter of, and that data that you spoke of, it's bringing in that data and saying, here's some of the things that I've tried to do. This is maybe where we need to bring in somebody from the outside. It's not a matter of pushing for them to be fired right away. It's a matter of, hey, how can we help this person first? How can we coach them? How can we get them? How can we help them improve? They're probably not aware of the impacts. Their intentions could be good, but they're not aware of of how this is coming off to other people.
Yeah.
And then from there, if things don't improve, then you need to continue to have those conversations.
Right. But as a supervisor or as a leader, when I have done all the things and I've given all the tools and had all the conversations, then that decision to be done with that team member is much easier.
Exactly.
Than it is. But if you just go straight to emotional response, I mean, it's not a fun place for anyone. And talk about then psychological safety being at an all-time low. If you're letting people go, or you're just listening to others and making decisions based off of that, that is the fastest track to low psychological safety. There's no question. Because again, it comes down to transparency and knowing what's going to happen when things are going well, but also when things aren't going so well. Justin, we could have chatted for another hour. I'm sure there is an hour worth of other questions. So how can we find you? What is the easiest way to find you if we've got questions for you?
Sure. Two easiest ways: through my website, cultureshiftconsulting.ca. The other easy way is connect with me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Justin Deonarine, Organizational Psychologist. Send me a connection, send me a message there. I do try to respond as quickly as I can, but sometimes, and I will be the first to apologize and say, I'm sorry it takes so long to respond, but sometimes it does take some time. But if you send me a message, I do try to respond as quickly as possible. But those are the two easiest ways: through my website or through LinkedIn.
Okay. And then you've got some pretty good content over on Instagram as well. So I'd encourage everyone to give you a follow that way too, to keep seeing what you're up to and that type of thing. So Justin, again, I'm so honored you joined us here today. Justin, you are up in Edmonton, but from what I understand, you work wherever, whenever. It's the beauty of COVID.
Yep. Everything's digital now.
Yeah.
But even previous to COVID, it was easy enough to pick up the phone.
Yeah.
So
awesome. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. The link will be available by the end of the week, and we'll be sending that out along with a couple of other ways to get a hold of Justin and those research papers that he talked about too. So thank you.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.